I'm so confused. What's going on, guys? So, I'm sorry if this is kind of weird because this is my first time at a stream, trying streaming here. Hopefully, everything's working good. Um, First live stream ever, so let's bear with me, boys and girls. So, what I want to talk about now is the Canadian House of Commons declaring a national climate emergency. So, yesterday, um, it was announced by the House of Commons that they are committing to meet the Paris Agreement emissions targets. So this was passed 186 to 63 with the support of the Liberals, New Democrats, Bloc Québécois, and the Green MPs. So the Conservatives were the only ones to vote against it. That's not surprising. The biggest thing I want to talk about in this is kind of the way in which people are looking at climate change as a key political tool rather than an actual rather than any actual care for the climate or the actual environment. I want to point out a few things. My cat's getting in my way, obviously. She gets in here every time I try to make a video. But the biggest thing here is just to understand that the Canadian government has done this before. And we've made a bunch of promises that we were not able to keep. And this is one of the big things why I wanted to make this video, is just go over the history of the Canadian government making promises like this. And one of the biggest things to understand is why the Conservatives might be a little hesitant to support such an initiative. Not that I'm saying that we shouldn't be supporting an initiative. Like, it might sound like I'm against this. I'm absolutely for this, but people need to understand what the main goals of these initiatives are. If they actually are for saving the environment, then I'm all for it. But if these are initiatives that are made more for political gain and to promote a certain agenda, then they need to be fully understood for what they are, right? So a big factor in my kind of skepticism towards this new deal and this new agreement is that it's happened before. The Canadian government has made promises before, and specifically the liberal government has made these promises before. So back in 2001, the Canadian government signed an agreement which was known as the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol was a environmental climate change agreement that was meant to lower emissions throughout the global society, throughout, every country was supposed to lower their emissions limits and was supposed to bring those levels down towards 1990s levels. So reducing annual CO2 emissions back to the 1990 levels was the stated purpose and goal of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, if anybody remembers, back in 2001, the Canadian government had signed these accords and had agreed that they would reduce emissions. Now, one thing that strikes me as similar is the fact that this is the same promise that we've made today, or yesterday, at least in the last 24 hours. We've made the same promise again. This time, we are declaring a national emergency in Canada. Isn't it funny how a decade ago, this was, or not even a decade ago, 8 years ago, this was something we were toying with. We were like, yeah, we're going to go reduce our emissions and we're going to be good for the world and for the environment. And then we totally backed out. And we totally changed 180, flipped all of the way we were talking, flipped our whole agenda, and we started to pull out of the Kyoto Protocol. And as you can read here, the decision to do so will save the government an estimated $14 billion in penalties. So one of the big issues with this Kyoto Protocol was that we signed this agreement, and what was going to happen was there was going to be penalties for those countries that could not reduce their emissions to the levels desired. So Canadian emissions could not be reduced below 1990s levels, and in that sense they were not able to meet the obligations of the protocol, and they would have to pay up to 14 billion in fines because of that. So one of the big things to understand about this agreement was we were not ready for it. We were not ready to go back to the 1990 levels of emissions. We were not ready to cut our emissions. We were not really putting much effort into this. We signed this agreement. We're like, yeah, we're great. We care about the environment. Look at what we're doing. And then when it came to the economic and the social concerns that conservatives would constantly bring up, it just wasn't going to work. So right here you can read how like a lot of conservatives were blaming an incompetent liberal government who signed the accord and then took little action to make the necessary greenhouse gas emission cuts. So this is one of the big things that I am concerned about. It's one thing to announce a climate emergency. It's one thing to declare that you are going to make changes and that you are going to act to promote reversing climate change. You can promote that you are going to reduce emissions, just like we were doing with the Kyoto Protocol. We can do all of these things, but the biggest issue becomes, can we do it, and will we do it? And this is the biggest concern I have. I'm all for reducing emissions. I'm all for having CO2 levels going back to the 1990s. The biggest issue becomes manufacturing and the economic issues that you have when you have to reduce emissions, because this means that all factories, all polluters, all mass corporate entities that are producing and creating emissions need to reduce those emissions, and that means they can only either produce less or they need to find better ways of dealing with the greenhouse gases. Now, most businesses and most corporations don't have, well, I shouldn't say they don't, they do have the money, but they don't want to put the money towards saving the environment. They're very greedy and they only care about their bottom line, and that doesn't mean putting billions of dollars into providing for the government, or sorry, the environment, giving to the government so that they can provide for the environment. But the biggest issue becomes many of these corporations make their money from the environment. Like, let's take, for example, someone like, I don't know, even a car manufacturer, right? So like you build car parts and you use metals that come from the earth, you use rubber that comes from the earth, you use all of these products that come from the earth, and you create these massive emission producing machines that really have no purpose other than to make people's lives easier. And I know most people will be like, well, that's a good thing. I want my life to be easier, and I want cars and all these things, and that's great. And I'm not fully against cars, but people need to understand that we do need to start reducing our emissions. We do need to start worrying about the environment. And the biggest issue I have is that I don't really think that these new agreements are actually there to save the environment. I think they're there to be political tools to gain support for certain agendas, but will that actually lead towards action? Will it lead towards a massive move to reduce emissions and to actually help the environment? I am very skeptical. I don't believe that that's truly what's going to happen. Just as what happened with the Kyoto Protocol, I believe that this will end up being a far-fetched initiative that is really just a political tool for the Liberal government and for the current what do you call them? The current environmental ministers to overplay their role and trying to force change. And that's one of the biggest things, it's like you can force change all you want, but if the corporations and the big polluters are not going to fall in line, and they're going to do whatever they have, whether take penalties, take taxes or tariffs or whatever you're going to put on them, sanctions, they'll take all that and they'll pay the fines, they'll pay the millions and millions of dollars if it means they can keep polluting, if it means they can keep manufacturing at the levels to keep up their bottom line, then they will keep doing it. And this is the biggest issue with climate change and with the environment, is that most corporations don't give a shit about the environment. And this is the big factor, because if corporations do not start to fall in line, or at least do what they're being asked, then these initiatives and these emergency, declarations of emergency will do nothing but act as bandages, act as rhetorical devices to point out the biggest issues in our society, but do nothing to actually rectify them. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say in this video. I just wanted to make a quick live video. I've never done it before, so this is my first one. Sorry if it was kind of awkward. I might make a couple more today just to try out the system. I want to start going live a little more and talk about news issues and things that I want to discuss. So this is my first live video. So like I said, don't judge me too harshly. And I'm hoping that the Canadian government and the Canadian society can come together and actually rectify what we've done to the environment and try to heal the earth and give all of our potentials and our energies to make this society better. But I'm skeptical, and I'll just leave it at that. Have a good day, guys. Bye bye.